Lesson 58, lead coefficients and more on completing the square. Very briefly, I just want to touch on what a lead coefficient is. First of all, we know that a coefficient is the number in front of a variable. Okay, we've talked about this before. Using mathematical terms, a coefficient is the number that comes in front of a variable. So a lead coefficient is one that leads. It's the number in front of the first variable when variables are written in descending orders of the powers. Okay, so it's the very first number in front of the very first variable when we write them in descending order of powers. Okay, so it's the first variable, first number in front of the first variable. Now, when we've been solving equations with completing the square, the first term is an x squared, which means it has a lead coefficient that is understood to be 1. If the lead coefficient is not 1, we need to do one extra step before we start completing the square. All right, so if the lead coefficient is not 1, what we need to do is divide every term by the lead coefficient. All right, so if the lead coefficient is not 1, we are going to divide every term by the lead coefficient. Now, unfortunately, this means a lot of times that we're going to end up with fractions. Not always, but a lot of the time, which is fine. It just makes it a little more challenging. Once we've divided every term by the lead coefficient, we can go ahead and solve completing the square as normal. All right, so let's look at a couple examples together. The first example that I want to go ahead and do is 4x squared plus 3x minus 3 equals 0. 4x squared plus 3x minus 3 equals 0. Now, we'll notice that our variables are written in descending order. We have an x squared term, an x squared, and a constant. Our lead coefficient in this case is 4. So since our lead coefficient is not 1, we need to go ahead and divide every term by 4. So we're going to divide 4 by 4, 3 by 4, and this 3 by 4. We can also divide 0 by 4, but 0 divided by anything is 0, so we can just leave that. So when I divide my first term by 4, I'm left with x squared plus 3/4 x minus 3/4 equals 0. From this point, now that my lead coefficient is 1, I'm going to go about solving completing the square as normal. So when we've done completing the square, we know that all of the x terms need to be on one side and everything else needs to be on the other. So what I'm going to do is add 3/4 to the other side of my equation. So now I have x squared plus 3/4 x equals 3/4. Now the goal in completing this square is to get a constant term here in this side of the equation so that we can factor. Alright, so in order to get that term, we do the rule with our middle term. We're going to take our middle term, which is 3/4, and we're going to divide it by 2, which really means we're going to multiply it by half. Well, 3/4 times 1/2 is 3/8. And then we're going to go ahead and square that term. Alright, so 3/8 squared is 9/64. So that becomes the last term. And remember, what we do to one side, we have to do to the other. So we're also going to be adding 9/64 to the other side of our equation. Now we have an equation on the left side of my equal sign that can be factored. X squared plus 3/4 x plus 9/64 can be factored to two binomials. And also remember that in completing the square, the two binomials are going to be the same. Okay, same variables, same numerical values, same sign. All right, so we have x. Both signs are plus, which means in our binomial, our sign is going to be positive. And keep in mind that the term that we use when we factor is going to be the term that we got when we divided. So it's going to be 3/8. So now we have x plus 3/8 squared is equal to, we're going to go ahead and add 3/4 and 9/64. Keep in mind, when you're adding fractions, we have to have a common denominator. All right, so the common denominator is 64. Well, 4 times 16 gives me 64, so I'm going to do 3 times 16. Which is 48. So this becomes 48 plus 9/64. And 48 plus 9 is 57. So we have 57/64. All right, now we can go ahead and take the square root of both sides. And the square root cancels out with the square, so I'm left with x plus 3/8 is equal to plus or minus. Now, the square root of 57 doesn't come out evenly, but the square root of 64 does. The square root of 64 is 8. All right, and then to get that x by itself, we're going to subtract it. So I have x equals -3 plus or minus the square root of 57, and it is all over 8. And that is the solution. All right, so dealing with lead coefficients, we have just one extra step. Let's go ahead and try one more example together. All right, in this example, we have 5x squared minus x minus 2 equals 0. Again, all of our terms are in descending order. Our lead coefficient is not 1, so the very first step that we need to do is divide every term by that lead coefficient. So I'm going to divide every term by 5. All right, well, 5 divided by 5 is 1, so I have x squared. The coefficient originally in front of this x is an understood one, so it's going to be minus 1/5 x minus 2/5 equals 0. From that point, we're going to complete the square as normal. We want to get all the x terms on one side and every other term on the other. So I'm going to add 2/5 to the other side of my equation. So now my equation reads x squared minus 1/5 x equals 2/5. Okay, we need to get that last term down there so that we can factor. All right, so we're going to follow our middle term rule. Take our middle term and divide by 2, or multiply by half, and we get 1/10. And then we're going to go ahead and square that, which will give us 1/100. So we're going to add 1/100 to both sides of the equation. Okay. Now I have it so that I can factor. Remember, the two binomials are going to be the same, okay? We have a negative and a positive, which means that our term is going to be negative, okay? Because two negatives equal a positive when they're multiplied, and we subtract them, we get negative. And our term is going to be 1/10, because that's what we got when we divided by 2. So I have x minus 1/10 squared equals, we need to go ahead and add 2/5 plus 1/100 by finding a common denominator. Common denominator is going to be 100. 5 times 20 gave me 100. 20 times 2 is 40. 40 plus 1 is 41, so I have 41/100. All right, again, to get that x term by itself, we take the square root of both sides. This square root cancels out the square, and I'm left with x minus 1/10 equals plus or minus. Square root of 41 cannot be simplified, but the square root of 100 is 10. And then to get x by itself, we add that 1/10 over to the other side. So I have 1 plus or minus the square root of 41 all over 10. And that is my final solution. What I'd like for you to do is go ahead and solve the next two examples on your own. First one is 3x squared plus 5x minus 6 equals 0. And the other is 3x squared minus x minus 1 equals 0. Go ahead and solve those two examples on your own. Make sure you take care of that lead coefficient first, and we will check them in class.